You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Health Podcast. I have Dr. Eva Detko. Dr. Eva, her research covers a lot of areas, physiology, biochemistry, nutrition, plant medicine, etc. Dr. Eva's had some health issues on her own, which I suspect has led her to all these interests in health. But I'll let her talk about that. So, Dr. Eva, thank you for coming. How you doing?
Hi, Richard. Yes, very well. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell me just a real brief background on yourself, and then we'll talk about your current work, if you don't mind.
Yeah, in fact, you were quite right when you said in your introduction that it was indeed my health issues that led me to the area or the many areas of studies, shall I say, but everything that I've studied really falls under the umbrella of natural medicine. And obviously it was a very long time ago now, but I had all sorts of initially digestive issues, fatigue type issues. Eventually, I ended up with a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and I also had Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune thyroid disease. And it soon became very clear to me that the conventional medicine, mainstream medicine approach was just not really going to do much for me. It was very, very limited, mainly limited to drug options and not much else. This didn't sit right with me, so I decided that if I was going to get better, I needed to do this on my own and take matters into my own hands. And so I started with nutrition and biochemistry, but I soon expanded to the areas of psychology, psychotherapy, obviously plant medicine as well, as you mentioned, energetic medicine. So by now, I do have quite a few modalities up my sleeve, and I do work with really complex health conditions. So I do indeed need to have a wide range of expertise in all sorts of modalities in order to help my clients the best that I can.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of modalities out there. What are some of the most common or tricky conditions that you help people with? And then what modalities do those tend to tie to?
So predominantly, I actually specialize in autoimmunity. Obviously, this is quite a broad area of work because by now we have in the region of 140 named autoimmune conditions. And in fact, there are a number of research groups out there who will argue that, in fact, most chronic illness is autoimmune at its very core. So, but there is a lot of complexity in terms of the work that I attract. People come to me with, after years and years and years of trying those things. They already tried different dietary protocols and detoxing protocols and whatever else they may have tried. And also with the physical issues that they have comes a lot of emotional complexity. And of course, the mainstream medicine, again, they forever try and separate the mind and the body, but indeed it's one and the same. It's one system. and we have to look at it as one system. So with physical illness, chronic complex physical illness comes a lot of emotional complexity as well. So I combine the physiological and biochemical side of illness, things such as nutritional therapy and plant medicine, herbs, all sorts of obviously supplements, nutritional vitamin, mineral supplements that comes under the umbrella of nutritional therapy. But in addition to that, there's an awful lot you can achieve with plants, herbs, essential oils, things like that. And then there is a whole load of things that I do on the emotional front. I've got quite a few different modalities that I use to deal with complex emotional stuff. And then, as well as that, I actually combine with that energetic approaches, so bioenergetics, as we call it. So so that's the combination of the three, the biochemistry, the bioenergetics, and the emotional work is really what brings the best result, because ultimately what I practice is root cause medicine. So just maybe people know this already, but mainstream medicine really looks at symptoms and addresses symptoms, and it breaks the body down into the different organs and systems, and it picks them out and just treats everything separately. That's quite a limited approach, and it never works well with chronic illness, because you need to treat the body as a whole. So natural medicine really is root, or functional medicine is root cause medicine. And the idea being that if you remove the offending factors that cause the illness in the first place, perhaps these are infections we're talking about, maybe environmental toxins, maybe emotional trauma, hormonal imbalances, food sensitivities, whatever it may be. There's quite a range of gut issues, things like leaky gut, microbiome dysbiosis, and microbiome imbalances. And if you remove, it usually is more than one thing that goes on. But what you find that if you remove the offending cause, that is where the body returns back to health. It could be that it returns back to health over time. It's not going to be overnight. But that's how you facilitate healing for that person, is by helping them identify and remove what made them sick in the first place.
Well, what would be an offending cause? What are some examples of that?
So with autoimmunity in particular, but this also applies to other chronic conditions, one of the main, the two probably main causes would be emotional trauma, and also intestinal hyperpermeability, otherwise known as leaky gut, as well as dysbiosis. So that is when in your gut you have this environment whereby you have microbes that are working for you, and also you can have microbes that are pathogenic. And if that balance is off, then there is going to be all sorts of impacts on health related to the gut not functioning correctly. Hormonal imbalance is another one. Food sensitivities is another one. And of course, infections, chronic infections, things like parasites, chronic viral and bacterial infections. So people think that just because they live in a civilized country, it's definitely not them, and they will not have parasites or things like that. But I can definitely promise you that if somebody has chronic health symptoms, there's usually a level of chronic infection going on in the body. So it's very interesting to see. Some people are more prone to maybe viral infections or retroviruses. Some people may be more prone to parasites or bacterial stuff. But usually, if there's chronic symptoms that have been going on for a long time, there will be usually some infections associated with that. And of course, we have environmental toxicity. And that's, all the glyphosates, all the nasty stuff that they spray on our food these days. Toxic metals is a big one. So mineral imbalances in the body could be caused by nutritional deficiencies, or insufficiencies, because our food is deficient in nutrients compared to 100 years ago. Our food is so much lower in nutrients these days than it used to be. The soil is depleted, so therefore the food is depleted. But at the same time, we've got a lot more toxicity in our environment. So you've got a lot of toxic metals coming at us from all sorts of directions. And so all of those things you see, and on top of that, there's of course electromagnetic sensitivity. But I find that electromagnetic sensitivity is always related to toxic metals or infections or something else. So, but if all of those factors combined start overloading somebody's system, then that system will start breaking down, because there just won't be enough capacity for the system to bounce back if you have all of those different things going on. So that's why it's not just one thing. In terms of those causal factors, it usually will be more than one, because your body normally has a massive capacity for healing and repair and regeneration. But if you start bombarding it with lots of toxins, and then you have emotional stresses, and then maybe you have food poisoning and you get an infection that way. So there's just things that just add up. And at some point, there is a, major bang going on. And then that's usually when people start experiencing symptoms, and then they get a diagnosis.
So what are some of the common ways that people will be exposed to substances that will lead them to other issues, that will lead them to EMF sensitivity or chemical sensitivity or, major health issues? Like, can you envision the whole path in your head now and maybe give an example of how this has happened to you or other people?
Yeah. So I do actually like to emphasize the fact that emotional trauma is a massive factor in illness. This is not just my say so. People may be familiar with ACEs study done originally in 1998 by CDC and Kaiser Permanente, whereby they screened 17,000 people, and they followed 17,000 people, and they looked at a correlation between early childhood trauma, they call it adverse childhood events, and disease later in life. And as it happens, that correlation is very strong with pretty much every single chronic illness known. So we're talking coronary heart disease, cancer, autoimmune disease. There's correlation with all of those. And of course, when it comes to trauma, a lot of it really is about perception. So it's not necessarily an event per se, but it's the person's response to a particular event. In other words, two people could be going through the same event, and one of them will come away traumatized and the other won't. That's the reason. The reason is because one person had a different response to the other compared to the other person. And that determined whether this particular event registered in the neurology as trauma or not. But these are things that happen in people's early years. That's why it's called early childhood trauma. And it's not always about big things such as abuse or divorce. Sometimes it's about little things that happened over a prolonged period of time. And when it comes to developmental trauma, which is a problem for a lot of people with chronic illness, it's more about what wasn't present rather than was present. So this is a trauma that is really about a lack of bonding in the first few years of our lives. So if there wasn't enough care and attention paid to a child, they may well end up with a developmental trauma, which will then cause permanent changes in the brain. It will cause permanent changes in the microbiome. And then as this person goes through life and other things get thrown at them, eventually this will they will end up with some sort of chronic problem. And another big one, a really big one, is, of course, environmental toxicity. So we're talking GMOs, we're talking glyphosates, everything that gets sprayed on food, herbicides, pesticides, extremely toxic toxic substances that, of course, if they get sprayed on a fruit and veg, we obviously are going to end up eating that if we eat inorganic fruits and vegetables. So it's very, very important these days to go for clean food and non-GMO food, because there's so much evidence that the damage this causes to our DNA and to the tissues and our health is just extreme. It's extremely concerning and extremely worrying. And glyphosate, obviously, the pesticides, herbicides is one aspect. And then, of course, we've got the toxic metals, which are obviously everywhere, and they are in the soil. They are obviously if people are smokers, then obviously that's one of the main exposures. But it's not just that. They appear in our household cleaning products, in our cosmetics, in our food. So again, the exposure is pretty much, we just cannot avoid it completely 100%. So the only way to deal with it. Yeah.
Well, you can't avoid it 100%, but what are some levels of action that people can take to reduce their exposure? What are the things that are around them that are the worst for them? Or is it different for everybody? And again, how can they take step 1 and step 2 and step 3, for instance? What are those steps?
So that's it's always the first step, obviously, food and water, because we put this in our bodies every single day, right? So if you live in a polluted city and you can't move away, which would be ideal, then of course this is something you're gonna be more affected than somebody who lives in the country and in a clean place, maybe in the mountains somewhere. So clearly, yes, people will have different levels of exposure. If somebody is a smoker, they'll have a different level of exposure than somebody who isn't. So there will be different levels. But the most simple step really is to clean up your food and water. So this would be, like I said, go for foods that are non-GMO and organic, because it makes so much difference. It's just incredible how much difference that makes to human health. And water, of course, is something that we need to be drinking an awful lot of water every day to keep ourselves in good health. And if that water is polluted, if it's filthy, if it's chlorinated or fluoridated or whatever else they're putting in your municipal water, this needs to be filtered out. So one of the most important things is to have a good, ideally, 5-stage filter, whole house filter, but also predominantly, obviously, the most important thing is what you put in your mouth. But also, if you shower in contaminated water, that will get through the skin very, very easily. That will get through the skin. So, of course, if you know that your water source is not very good, then having a filter for the whole house is a very good idea. And of course, talking about what gets through in terms of through the skin, then we need to be thinking what products we use and we put on our skin. So again, going cleaner makeup, in terms of the
deodorants, yes, things like that.
Absolutely, yes. There's so many. There's heavy metals in. So, for instance, there's aluminium in your deodorants, right? In your conventional deodorants, but you can do perfectly well with an organic version that is aluminium free and contains essential oils. So those things can be easily replaced. So it's not something that, oh my God, now I have to live without it. How do I do this? It's impossible. It's not impossible. It's just actually, once you make that step and make those transitions, it's actually fairly straightforward. You just need to be aware of what it is that you are using and how to, replace it with something better. And there's so much on the market these days, products that are far cleaner and far better. So that's just a few simple steps.
How do people not feel overwhelmed by all this? It sounds like anything that goes on you, in you, or is around you can affect you, those 3 broad categories. And, we're going through them, but, someone that's new to this, that's not feeling well, what are some of the first steps you take them through? I guess, let's take a little bit different track. How do you even figure out what is wrong with someone? The root cause? What are some of the steps you'll take with them?
Okay, so if somebody's really, really sick, they're unlikely to figure it out on their own. I'd like to say that everybody can do their own healing. But unfortunately, if you have a lot of symptoms, and if you don't know whether you're coming or going, you do need help of either a healthcare practitioner, a naturopathic practitioner, or a functional medicine practitioner, because you do need to test for some of those things. So you cannot just guess. You cannot just do this through guesswork, because otherwise you may be on it for a very long time. And if you start going down the wrong path, you could be causing more damage than good. So that's number one. You won't necessarily be able to. If you have a lot of complex symptoms and, there's lots of chronic symptoms you're struggling with, maybe, headaches, fatigue, skin problems, etc. And all of this is kind of starting to limit the way you're living your life, then you really do need a very good qualified practitioner to help you unravel this mystery. So, but the simplest number one, okay, and I do know that people can get overwhelmed with this, because unfortunately it's getting worse. And unfortunately, I'd like to say, oh, don't worry about it, it will get better. It won't get better, because unfortunately the world is more toxic, and it will be more toxic. And people who could be doing something about it, like the people at the top, unfortunately are hell-bent on going the other way, because it's all about, it's essentially, pesticide companies, they make a lot of money out of their chemicals. They are big, conglomerates. Right. There's a lot of money in that. So this is not going away. So the only thing
within the realm of testing, like, what are some of the first tests that you'll, suggest people get regardless of what's going on with them? Or does it really depend on what they're telling you is wrong, and then you
absolutely
start with different tests?
Absolutely, it depends, because it there's no point spending thousands of dollars for tests you don't need. So if I said, everybody should be doing this, or everybody should be doing that, potentially I'm sending people to spend money they don't need to spend. So I really wouldn't like to be saying that this test is for everybody and this isn't. The one test that is very, very useful pretty much for anybody to do, I would say, is hair tissue mineral analysis. But the but is that you really do need a good practitioner to interpret. In other words, somebody needs to be trained to interpret this. This is not just you sending hair to the lab and getting the results and knowing what to do with it. It's far, far complex than that. It needs proper training, and it's a lot of hours of training to know how to properly interpret that. This is one very, very useful thing to do.
What are some minerals that you would look at, for instance? Like, what's an example of this particular set of tests? What would you look at?
So in that particular set of in this particular test, what you will look is you will look at the major macro minerals: calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. Even from those four minerals, you can already have a good idea of somebody's metabolic rate, and also whether they're slow oxidizer, as we say, or fast oxidizer, how they detox. You can already deduce what sort of health problems they might be prone to, and together with symptoms. Because if I work with somebody, you see, I've got a lot of questionnaires for them to fill in to begin with, because I can actually get quite a good picture of what's happening for them just by the symptoms that they're experiencing and the different things that I can ask them about. They can already start pointing me in the right direction there. So then when I'm doing, for instance, if I do the hair mineral analysis with somebody, then I can already be looking at, well, are they, for instance, what's their adrenal function? What's their thyroid function? And then we could be looking at other metals. For instance, most people these days have iron overload. People think they're iron deficient. That's really, really not the case. What's happening is there's a very complex relationship between iron and copper. And if you have bio-unavailable iron and bio-unavailable copper, you can start accumulating those metals in the tissues, and that alone could be causing nasty symptoms such as aching joints and fatigue and headaches and migraines and various things like that. So then, and of course, in the hair mineral analysis, will also give you some indication on how you excreting those toxic metals. that you may be ingesting, or stuff that may already be in your tissues even from birth. Because something like lead, for instance, lead is stored in the bone tissue a lot, you see. So often people, women are pregnant, and of course there is quite a turnover of bone tissue throughout pregnancy. And if that lead gets freed up into the bloodstream, that lead is going to end up in the fetus. So the baby will already be born with a degree of lead toxicity. This is not going to be acute toxicity. They're not necessarily going to be symptomatic, but they're already accumulating this extremely toxic metal from the word go. And that's even before anything else, right? So there's a lot of information that can be obtained from just doing this one test. But of course, there's all sorts of, so I mentioned that gut is another big link between, so gut, lack of proper functioning in the gut and chronic illness, that there's massive correlation there. So there are various labs that one can do to look at, for instance, the function of how the microbiome functions, what bacteria they actually have in the gut, what bacteria they're lacking, where the imbalances are, and also, of course, what foods there may be. For instance, there is a specific test, actually, Viome, that actually looks at the DNA of those different microbes. And from that test, you can see where the imbalances are, and you can also see what foods are feeding your microbiome quite nicely and what foods are not so good for you specifically to eat. This is the reason why I would never have one protocol for everybody. So if you see a nutritional protocol that very sort of strictly prescribes you must be eating this and you mustn't be eating that, most of the time that's complete nonsense, because everybody's an individual. People will react to different foods. So even if you decide to follow a nutritional protocol, you still need to adapt it to your individual needs, because you may be, they may be telling you, eat 2 cups of broccoli every day. But if you happen to react to broccoli, or genetically you don't work well with broccoli, then that's obviously a really silly idea for you to be eating. Just because it's good for most people doesn't mean it's good for you, right? So we need to be looking at people as individuals.
Yeah, maybe to put some specifics on this, any case studies, without names or anything, but case studies that really stand out to you of people that you've worked with and what happened?
Yes. So for example, so I work with autoimmunity. So let's just say, and this is actually true for many cases of fibromyalgia. What happens in my fibromyalgia specifically is that, as in many chronic illness actually, that the minerals are completely out of balance, and some minerals will be really, really high, but stored in the wrong tissue. So the example of that is calcium. So calcium, we want calcium to be in the bone. That's what makes our bones healthy and strong, is the calcium. However, in the case of fibromyalgia and other conditions as well, what you see is that calcium is not in the bone. So the calcium, so somebody could have calcium deficiency. They could still have osteoporosis, but they have too much calcium in the wrong part of the body, namely soft tissues. So then what happens is the calcium accumulates, rather than accumulating in the bone, it starts to accumulating in the muscles, in the tendons, and that over time contributes to pain and stiffness, which is one of the main features of fibromyalgia. So all over body pain and stiffness. So if you then take specific steps to rebalance that, you can, so that would be, one of the root causes in this case. And if you rebalance that correctly, that person will recover their health. Another example would be if somebody has very low sodium levels, they will have weak adrenal function. So if I have somebody with weak adrenal function, which is a lot of people with chronic fatigue these days, people have fatigue for all sorts of reasons, but it's always linked to poor adrenal function. Right. And if you see that, then that is likely to be the case. This person's tissue level of sodium and potassium will be out of balance. So again, you see, just with I'm not saying this. I'm not saying this is, by the way, really easy and simple, because that takes commitment. It takes a few months of eating mostly vegetables for starters to get the mineral levels up to the level where they need to be. But then over time, with those specific changes, people do get better.
Okay, so any correlation between how long someone's been sick and how long it takes for them to get well?
Generally speaking, it really depends on the starting point. It does, but if it's really, really complex, and if there's have sort of toxic metals involved, if we need to detoxify parasites and then toxic metals, and then, at the same time, you could be dealing with emotional work alongside it. We could be talking sometimes 6 to 12 months is a good amount of time if it's fairly straightforward. But if people have been sick for a very long time, and they have a lot of infections and toxicity in their bodies, then it could be, we could be talking a couple of years. The hardest tissue to detoxify in the body is brain tissue. So a lot of people will have fatigue symptoms, for instance, brain fog, those sort of neurological type fatigue. And that usually means there's something sitting in the brain tissue. There's something that's got through the blood-brain barrier and accumulated in the brain tissue, and that needs to be detoxified. So when we're talking about detoxifying brain tissue, then that is probably what takes the longest. So sometimes it can take a couple of years to fully detoxify it. The reason why we want to do it over a longer period of time rather than go hell for leather and do it quickly is because if somebody's got a lot of toxicity, which usually a lot of chronic symptoms means a lot of toxicity, that's the correlation, that's pretty much always the case. But if we do it too quickly, and you start offloading all this toxic stuff, the body needs to remove it. The body needs to deal with it appropriately. So if you do it too quickly, you can make somebody sicker rather than help them. So sometimes things need to be done a little bit more slowly because it makes sense, because then the body can do it at its own pace and you're not actually damaging anything in the process, and the body can, heal and repair as it's going along.
Okay. Well, very good. For people that are listening and need help, and they've maybe tried a whole host of things that haven't worked, what's the best way for them to get in touch and to find out more from you and about you?
So my website is really the best place, and then you can contact me and follow me from my website. You can get to the right places, and it's dr-eva.com. So it's Dr. Eva, but it's dr-eva.com, and that's the best place. And if if I can't help you, I may be able to point you in the right direction. The one thing that I want to say to people is don't be overwhelmed. If you are feeling overwhelmed by what this information that I'm sharing, it can be overwhelming, but you do need some. If you're having loads of symptoms, you do need some support, and if you get the right support, then you'll be able to break it down, and step by step you can make yourself better with the right help, because it's not about trying to do everything at once. You need to break it down, do things slowly, do things in the right order, and then you will eventually get to where you want to be, because there is hope for most people. There is obviously such a point, there's such a thing as point of no return when the body is so damaged and you have so much degeneration in the tissues that you may not be able to recover your health fully, but you can always improve and you can always get better no matter where you are. Only death is final. If we're still alive and kicking, then there's always something we can do to improve.
That's great. Well, Dr. Eva, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right, hold on a second.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, There's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.